Hi, Premier Smith. Good to have you back on the show.
Hi, Vassy.
Thanks for making the time. The price of oil, Premier, is currently higher than it was when you announced your promise of a tax cut. What actually prevents you from instituting it and providing exactly what you described back in May as timely tax relief to Albertans at a time when they need it most?
One of the things that we want to do is make sure that we can wean ourselves off of our reliance on resource revenues. And my finance minister had taken a look at where we were at and was a little bit concerned about the volatility that we're seeing in oil and gas prices. He's also concerned that we have to refinance a bunch of debt at a higher interest rate, and that there are some things that we have to wait to occur with the Trans Mountain Pipeline coming on and Coastal GasLink. So together we decided that it would be a bit more prudent, since our number one promise to Albertans was to not run deficits again, that we delayed the tax cut for an additional year to make sure that our revenues are sustainable, as well as that we're able to have a level of spending control so that we can make room for those cuts.
And I certainly take the point in the policy imperative behind that, but I guess I'm confused about what really has changed, because those interest rates were very high back in May when you initially made the announcement. Trans Mountain was going to come online back in May. The inflation situation was as punctuated as it is now. Your message at the time was that Albertans needed that relief. Do you no longer believe they do?
We absolutely do need the relief, but we also need to make sure that we're running balanced budgets. And look, when you campaign, you have a 4-year mandate to be able to implement all of your plans. We would have loved to have been able to afford to do it immediately, but I think people will understand that a 1-year delay is just prudent as we're going through making some pretty substantive changes to the healthcare delivery. We have more investment that we need to do to catch up on education with the growth of the province that has occurred over the last year. As well, we know that we are going to see some volatility in interest rates, and that's going to impact our ability to refinance, and that also increases finance charges. So we just want to make sure that Albertans know that we take the responsibility of running balanced budgets seriously, and we will absolutely be implementing that tax cut, and we'll make sure people know what the schedule is in this upcoming budget.
Did you not take those concerns as seriously when you wanted to get reelected, and now that you have a majority mandate, you are?
There will be a tax cut, and it will be exactly as promised. That will bring in an 8% rate. It'll apply to incomes under $60,000. We've already indexed our income tax system. We've indexed all of our major programs. We've provided a variety of different types of supports and tax relief, so that people are able to have more affordability, more money in their pockets, and we're going to implement that policy as well in the coming years.
And so, just to be sure, you're saying exactly next year that you'll bring in the tax cut. You said in your address that it will be brought in, quote, responsibly. Are we to interpret from that there's any wiggle room around the next year deadline, or timeline rather?
One of the things that I would say is that we know that we have to make sure that our spending is increasing in a sustainable way with our revenues. And so we have to make sure that our revenues are solid and stable, and we have to make sure that our spending is solid and stable. So we'll have a better idea of how the kind of progress that we're making on managing some of those spending challenges over the course of the next year. And then we have a plan that we'll put forward in our budget next week, so people know when we intend to implement the tax cut.
Do I interpret from that it's possible it isn't next year? And can you confirm to Albertans who are watching this interview that it will be through this mandate at some point, if not in the next year?
It 100% will be in this mandate. But what I would say is that we've got to make sure that we meet our number one goal. And people expect that our government is going to run balanced budgets. So when my finance minister is concerned that we're getting a little bit too close to running potential deficits, I have to take that seriously. And so we're going to make sure that when the tax cut comes in, is going to be sustainable, and we'll still be able to run balanced budgets.
And I have some questions about the spending decisions on the horizon, but I first wanted to ask you about another part of your address, which kind of feeds into what you were discussing, which is around kind of more saving in the long term, and the Heritage Fund, which was developed decades ago, and after the first decade, never really used for its original intention. From what you said last night, it sounds to me like you want to turn back to what it was originally intended to be. And you referenced the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Norway, which now sits, I think, at $1.6 trillion compared to about $25 billion in the Alberta Heritage Fund. I wonder, though, in that reference, if you are distinguishing between what Norway does, which is tax those oil companies at a far higher rate than Alberta, and what you're prepared to do, because I didn't glean from your remarks that that's in the cards.
I know Norway has a Crown-owned oil company, so that's part of the reason why they get higher revenues. We used to have a Crown-owned gas company, but it did get sold a number of years ago. We have a different type of approach that we take, which is why we may have to be a little more modest in our aspirations. But having a target of 250 to 400 billion is absolutely achievable. If we had just kept the base capital and invested the investment income over time, we'd already be there. So if we can do a little bit better by having $1 or $2 billion of windfall revenues each year going into that fund to be able to accelerate that growth, I think that it's absolutely achievable within 25 years to be reaching that target.
So it won't be something like when the fund was originally set out, like 30% of resource revenue will go into there. Do you have a specific target? When you say $1 to $2 billion, is that essentially the range you're looking at?
No, I would hope that it would be at least that amount. The problem is that we've just become so reliant on resource revenues that year after year, instead of managing spending growth to be matching what our long-term revenue picture was, we just ended up in a province relying on that next big boom. And so we now have an amount of resource revenue that I just think it's unsustainable to be spending this much of it. And it would take just a little bit of discipline to make sure that we have that extra amount to set aside. If we have more substantial surpluses, we've got more substantial choices. I mean, remember, we still have $80 billion worth of debt we need to pay down. And our fiscal plan requires us to put 50% of surpluses towards that. But then we have some latitude with the other 50% to either put more on debt, put money into savings, or do one-time spending. So we'll continue with that strategy. But I wanted the public to know that these are the active discussions me and my finance minister are having. And we think that this will set us up for future prosperity.
Couldn't you generate more substantial surpluses by taking a look at the revenue side and the taxation side of things? And I'm not talking about personal income tax, or I'm not talking about sales tax. I know that you've ruled those out. I worked in Alberta. I know that they're not popular concepts there either. But on the oil ledger side of things, I take your point around there being a crown corporation, for example, in Norway. But there are a lot of other companies. I think the total taxation rate right now, as far as royalties and income tax for corporations go, is something like 78% in Norway. I would never expect you to go anywhere near that, but you're using taxpayer money, for example, to clean up their mess when it comes to abandoned wells, to subsidize their decarbonization efforts, and you're not willing to take more to build up the Heritage Fund or to offset what could amount to pretty consequential spending decisions in the future. Why not?
Well, first of all, we have a mandate on energy companies to spend their own money to clean up their own wells. That's $700 million a year that we're requiring them to do, because we know that there's about a $30 billion liability. So that's the approach that we've taken here. We also reduced our corporate income tax rate, knowing that would spur more investment and more development in our province, and it's worked. I mean, when the prior government increased the rate, it actually reduced the amount of revenue. We reduced the rate, and now we're getting more corporate income tax revenue than ever before. We also have a royalty structure that is generating a large number of revenues for us, and we have the potential to see an expansion of our production with the opening of the Trans Mountain and the Coastal GasLink pipeline. So I think we get a lot of resource revenue in. It's just we can't run our entire budget on this boom and bust cycle. I believe this year it's somewhere around $20 billion of resource revenue, and the budget is spending $16 billion of it. So we want to make sure that we have a strategy over the next number of years where we can reduce the reliance on resource revenue, grow an additional potential future source of revenue, so we're really setting ourselves in a good position for 2050 when we also reach our carbon neutrality target.
And I understand that, but in Norway, they've been able to leverage the revenue that they have been able to derive from resource companies and turn that into $1.6 trillion. Again, the contrast with Alberta is $25 billion. I take your point about the corporate tax rate, but there is $1.2 billion taxpayer dollars that was spent on well closures in 2022. You're going to spend between $3.2 and $5.3 billion of taxpayer money between 2024 and 2035 on decarbonization and the carbon capture tax credit that you're offering. I understand the objective laid out there, but you're pumping more taxpayer money into companies that make so much profit instead of trying to look at what else you can garner to help sustain the province in the long run.
Look, it's not one or the other. It's both. I mean, we do have an Alberta Petroleum Marketing Agency, and I have tasked my energy ministry to see if there are ways that we can leverage that capacity that we have to get greater value for our product. I think that we're going to see that there is greater value for our product to be had. We have also invested in some of those tax credits so that we can do more value added here. As part of the petrochemical incentive program that Dow Chemical is investing over $10 billion in our province on net zero plastics. We're going to get net zero hydrogen being invested in our province as well. So some of those tax credits are to be able to enable us to not only to embrace greener options in the future for different types of value added, but also create new revenue streams. So I think it's a balance. I think people understand that the energy industry is going to be generating a significant amount of dollars for us in the foreseeable future. We just have to make sure that we don't spend all of it this time. We've got to make sure that we're investing properly, and we're also putting money aside so that in 2050, if it is the case that our product is less coveted, less valuable on the international markets, that we still have enough base revenue to be able to support the programs that people care so much about.
But respectfully, you are making a decision. You're delaying the implementation of a personal income tax cut, essentially, and not making the decision to further tax corporations, which are specifically oil corporations, which have the benefit of the environment that your party has created over the years in Alberta. Like, that's a decision that will impact Albertans.
Well, I have to tell you, I mean, that was also one of the reasons we won the election, is the other party offered that. They said that they would increase corporate income tax revenues, and Albertans said, you know what, that'll scare investment away, it'll scare jobs away. And they didn't want to go down that track. They wanted us to stay the course on creating the best investment environment in Canada, which we're going to do. But I think that Albertans know, because they manage their own budgets. They know that they've got to save a little for the future. They've got to pay down their mortgages and their debt. They've got to manage their household budgets. And I think they expect their government to do the same. So we're providing an approach that I think balances those items. And I think Albertans will understand that if it requires just a little bit of belt tightening for one more year, just to make sure that we don't go into deficit, I think that that's a sacrifice that Albertans will be willing to make.
Just to be clear, though, you're asking them to make a sacrifice for potentially more than a year, because you wouldn't commit to exactly a year before you bring that in.
As I said, I can't see the crystal ball about what our revenues are going to look like a year from now. I'm very hopeful because of the environment that we've created, the diversification that we're having in our economy, the discipline that our ministers have shown in limiting year-over-year spending increases in their department. And I'm pretty confident that we're going to be able to chart a pathway to make sure that tax break is fully implemented before the next election. So, as I said, it'll be more clear when we reveal our budget in a week's time.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Premier, I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
You bet. Thanks, Vassy.